I managed the business center at a conference facility in Brussels. And last month I watched an American consultant walk into our EU-US Trade Council meeting carrying a baseball bat. Not as a weapon, he genuinely believed it was standard to bring visual aids for negotiation breakdowns. He announced he'd learned this technique from a Harvard Business School podcast about power moves and international trade disputes. When our German delegation leader asked why he brought sports equipment to a policy discussion, the American explained that back home, having a symbolic bat shows you're ready to play hardball, but keeping it friendly. He spent 11 minutes describing how this was actually a sign of good faith because he chose a wooden bat instead of aluminum, which would have been too aggressive for European sensibilities. The German just stared. The consultant then offered to autograph the bat for everyone as an icebreaker activity. He seemed genuinely confused when security suggested he store it in his hotel minutes later. The same consultant interrupted the opening remarks to ask when we'd be getting to the real meeting. When informed this was the official commencement of the 3-day summit, he laughed and said, "Americans never waste time with ceremonial stuff, because efficiency is basically our superpower." He pulled out a one-page agreement he'd drafted on the flight over, announcing he'd streamlined months of bureaucracy into actionable bullet points. The document proposed that the EU simply adopt American trade law, since it's clearly more advanced. With a footnote citing his cousin who works at a shipping company as his policy expert, our French commissioner asked if he'd reviewed any of the 247-page briefing documents sent last month. He said he'd skimmed the executive summary on his Uber ride from the airport, which gave him everything he needed. He then suggested we could wrap this whole trade dispute up before lunch if everyone just agreed his way was common sense. The afternoon session. During the presentation on tariff structures, he kept raising his hand to ask why Europeans make everything so complicated. When our Italian trade minister explained the complexities of 27-member consensus building, the American nodded sympathetically and said Italy should just do what America does and let one person make all the decisions quickly. He described this as leadership efficiency. He seemed baffled when multiple delegates explained that's the opposite of how the EU functions. He suggested they were overthinking it. I work as a liaison officer at the European Commission's Directorate General for Trade in Brussels, and I watched an American lobbyist from a tech company march into a formal policy consultation wearing shorts and a hoodie. When our Austrian representative politely noted that the dress code was business formal, the American explained this was actually more formal than his usual attire because he'd chosen his nice shorts, and the hoodie didn't have any stains. He said back home, smart casual is basically the uniform of innovation, and that European dress codes were holding the continent back from competing with Silicon Valley. He pulled up photos on his phone of Mark Zuckerberg wearing a t-shirt, as if that proved legislative meetings should have no standards. When asked to at least wear shoes instead of sandals for the afternoon session, he argued that closed-toe footwear restricts creative thinking, citing a Stanford study he definitely read but couldn't remember the title of. He suggested the real issue was Europe's fear of disruption. I'm an assistant to a Polish MEP, and we met with an American trade delegation that kept addressing everyone by first names immediately, including calling our 68-year-old senior diplomat Buddy, when my boss gently suggested using formal titles and surnames. The lead American explained that hierarchy is outdated and that flat organizations are proven to be more productive. He said calling people by titles creates unnecessary barriers and that the American way of instant familiarity builds trust faster. He referenced a TED Talk about psychological safety in the workplace, seemingly unaware that a parliamentary trade negotiation isn't a startup pitch meeting. When the Polish delegation continued using formal address, the American sage whispered to his colleague that Europeans were stuck in the past with their weird formality hang-ups. He spent the coffee break trying to get everyone to do team-building exercises to break down those walls. Body participated, which he interpreted as shyness rather than preference for professional boundaries. My brother manages cultural exchange programs in Vienna, and he hosted an American business school group that insisted on starting every meeting with icebreakers. At a session with the Austrian Chamber of Commerce, The visiting professor made everyone stand in a circle and share two truths and a lie about their trade policy experience. The Austrian executives, who'd blocked out 30 minutes for substantive discussion, watched in bewilderment as the Americans explained this was crucial for building rapport, and that you can't do business without knowing the person behind the professional. One executive tried to politely decline and proceed to the actual agenda. The professor said he was detecting resistance to vulnerability, which in American corporate culture is seen as a growth opportunity. He produced a handout about the neuroscience of connection in business settings, insisting the research was irrefutable. The Austrians sat through 18 minutes of forced fun, during which the professor kept saying this was normal and helpful. When the meeting finally turned to actual trade matters, there was time for exactly 2 questions before everyone had to leave. I worked the reception desk at a ministry building in Copenhagen. An American consultant arrived 25 minutes late to a meeting with our trade secretary, holding a coffee cup the size of a small bucket. When I mentioned the meeting had already started, he waved it off and said being fashionably late shows you're in demand, and that punctuality is actually a sign you're not busy enough. He explained that in American business culture, arriving exactly on time makes you look desperate, and that successful people always run behind because they're juggling so much. He said Denmark's obsession with punctuality was kind of cute but impractical in the real world, where important people operate on fluid schedules. When informed our secretary had another appointment in 20 minutes, and this tardiness meant they'd lost half their meeting time, he suggested the secretary clear his calendar because this conversation was obviously the priority. He seemed genuinely shocked when told Danish officials don't rearrange state business around someone's poor time management. He muttered something about European inflexibility, stifling entrepreneurship, as he was escorted to a very brief meeting. I'm a server at a diplomatic restaurant in The Hague, where world leaders often dine, and I served an American trade official who, upon sitting down, immediately asked if I could recommend the most authentic European food on the menu. When I explained we serve contemporary Dutch cuisine with French influences, she looked confused and said she wanted real European food, like what Europeans actually eat. I suggested our stampot or our fresh North Sea cod. She frowned and asked if we had anything more universal, like pizza or a burger, as those were European inventions, and therefore authentically European. When I gently noted pizza is Italian and burgers are actually American, she insisted burgers were definitely from Hamburg, Germany. So this restaurant in the Netherlands should serve them as part of our cultural duty. She explained that Americans understand European food better than Europeans because they have more objectivity. She ended up ordering a Caesar salad, which she called a safe European choice, apparently unaware it was invented in Mexico by an Italian immigrant. My cousin manages a cafe near the European Parliament buildings in Strasbourg, and an American policy advisor came in during a busy morning rush and asked for a refill to go. When told we don't do free refills and that to-go cups cost extra, he laughed and said he wasn't falling for that joke because coffee refills are a basic human right. He explained that America invented coffee culture, and therefore Europeans must do refills. Probably just don't advertise it. When my cousin reiterated that French cafes charge per cup with no refills, the American accused him of price gouging tourists and said this practice was why American coffee chains like Starbucks were more successful. He pulled out his phone to show Yelp reviews proving Americans expect free refills everywhere, as if crowdsourced expectations change French business practices. He suggested the cafe could learn a lot from American efficiency. When he finally accepted he'd have to pay for a second coffee, he left a 25% tip and loudly announced he was showing Europeans how proper service gratuity works. The other French customers looked baffled. I work as a sommelier at a Michelin-starred restaurant in Lyon, and an American tech executive dining with European partners sent back a €300 Burgundy because it wasn't cold enough. When I explained this wine is traditionally served at cellar temperature to appreciate its complexity, he said that back home all wine is chilled because warm drinks are unsanitary. He claimed the American FDA requires all beverages below 45 degrees for safety reasons, which is completely invented, but he stated it with absolute certainty. He asked if France had food safety standards or if they were still in this medieval period. When I offered to chill a different wine if he preferred, he declined and said he'd just tough it out with this warm wine to be polite, but Europeans should really modernize. He spent the rest of the meal explaining to his mortified European colleagues that proper wine. Storage was one area where America led the world. One of the French guests quietly asked for a separate check. I'm the operations manager at the EU Parliament's cafeteria. And an American journalist covering trade negotiations kept complaining about our portion sizes. He'd order the daily special, eat everything, then come back to say the meal was half the size of American portions and ask if we'd forgotten part of his order. When staff explained this was the standard serving, he insisted Europeans must be malnourished if they consider this a full meal. He calculated that American plates have 60% more food on average, citing a study he'd seen in a documentary, and suggested the EU should adopt American portion standards for the health of its citizens. He seemed to view the generous European portions as evidence of scarcity rather than different cultural norms. He brought his own granola bars and would loudly snack during afternoon sessions, telling nearby delegates that he had to supplement because European meals left him hungry. Multiple people told him our portions were intentionally balanced. He maintained Americans simply had heartier appetites from being more productive. I'm a ticket agent at Amsterdam Central Station, and an American couple approached my window asking for directions to Amsterdam, Netherlands, Europe. When I confirmed they were currently in Amsterdam, they seemed confused and explained they wanted to go to the real Amsterdam, not just the train station. I clarified this is Amsterdam city center. The woman pulled out her phone, showing a Google Maps pin of Dam Square, 3 blocks away, and said she'd booked a trip to Amsterdam so she needed to get there from here. When I suggested they could walk in 5 minutes, her husband objected that Americans don't walk between cities and asked which train goes there. I explained again that they're already in Amsterdam and Dam Square isn't a separate city. He argued that if it had a different name, it must be a different place. Following the same logic as New York having neighborhoods, he asked why European geography was so confusing and poorly organized. I drew them a map. They thanked me but went to find a taxi instead. Apparently convinced I was confused about my own city's layout. My brother is a train conductor on the Paris Line TGV line. An American passenger flagged him down to complain about false advertising because the high-speed train wasn't as fast as she expected. When informed, we were traveling at 320 kilometers per hour. She said American trains go way faster and that France was exaggerating its technology. My brother explained France has one of the world's fastest rail networks. She countered that America invented trains and therefore must have superior ones, even though she admitted she'd never been on an American train because nobody uses trains in America, which proves they've moved on to better things, she said. The fact that she could see trees out the window meant the train obviously wasn't moving very fast. Using her visual perception as more reliable than the speedometer, she suggested France was rounding up the numbers. When my brother showed her the GPS speed reading, she said, GPS isn't accurate in Europe because of metric system interference. She spent the rest of the journey loudly telling other passengers that European infrastructure was overrated. I work as a tourism coordinator in Helsinki, and an American travel blogger contacted me asking which cities were close to Finland for a day trip. I suggested Tallinn across the bay in Estonia, or Stockholm if he wanted to take a longer ferry. He said he meant cities within Finland that were near Finland, explaining he wanted to visit Finland, but also stay close to Finland in case he needed familiar territory. When I explained Helsinki is in Finland, he grew frustrated and said Americans know geography better than Europeans give them credit for. And could I please just answer his question about what's near Finland besides Finland? I clarified that other Finnish cities are also in Finland. He accused me of being deliberately obtuse and said he'd studied a map before his trip. So he knew Finland was a small island near Norway, and he just wanted to know what else was on the island. I informed him Finland is not an island, but a country sharing borders with Sweden, Norway, and Russia. He said that didn't sound right, and he'd check with a more reliable source. He later posted a blog review calling Finnish tourism officials unhelpful and geographically confused. I'm the language coordinator at the EU Translation Center in Luxembourg. and an American delegation arrived for meetings insisting they needed translators only for the European language. When I asked which of the 24 official EU languages they meant, the delegation leader said, whichever one Europeans speak, the main one that everyone uses. I explained that English, German, and French are the most common working languages, but that every country has its own. He interrupted to say that in America, everyone speaks American despite coming from diverse backgrounds. So Europe probably has something similar. He suggested we were overcomplicating things, and that most Europeans probably just speak one shared language but don't tell tourists to seem sophisticated. When I arranged for multilingual support, he seemed annoyed by the expense and said back home they'd solve this problem by having everyone speak the same language, implying Europe's diversity was an inefficiency rather than reality. He asked why the EU hadn't standardized communication to be more like America. I gave up and scheduled translators for English, German, French, Polish, and Dutch. I manage a language school in Barcelona, and an American expat enrolled in Spanish classes, but kept arguing with our Catalan instructor about pronunciation. He'd insist certain words were wrong because his Mexican coworker back in Texas said them differently. And since America has the largest Spanish-speaking population outside Latin America, American Spanish must be the correct version. When the teacher explained that Castilian Spanish differs from Latin American dialects, he said that didn't make sense because Spanish is Spanish, just like English is English everywhere. He claimed linguistic variation was a myth invented to confuse language learners, and that there's one proper way to speak each language. He'd consistently correct the native Spanish teacher based on what he'd heard in American restaurants. When other students asked him to stop disrupting class, he said he was actually helping everyone by pointing out errors before they learned bad habits. He eventually quit, leaving a review stating that European Spanish teachers don't know Spanish as well as Americans who've been exposed to the authentic version through cultural proximity. I work as a cultural attaché at the American Embassy in Berlin. And during a reception marking 75 years of transatlantic partnership, an American businessman gave an impromptu toast about how America had taught Europe how to do business properly after World War II, and that Europeans should be grateful for American economic guidance. He raised his glass and said, "The best thing Europe ever did was become more like America," and that this trade tension everyone was worried about could be solved if the EU just admitted American methods were superior. The room went completely silent. A Danish diplomat quietly set down her glass and left. The businessman seemed puzzled by the reaction, asking if he'd said something controversial. When I gently suggested his framing might not resonate with Europeans who view the relationship as a partnership, it's between equals, he chuckled and said he was just being honest, and that Europeans were too sensitive about historical facts. He continued circulating, telling anyone who'd listen that the EU's economic policies would improve if they studied American business schools. I spent the rest of the evening doing diplomatic damage control. As the reception ended, he approached me to say he'd had a great time networking and felt he'd really connected with the European perspective. The Great Divorce might not be about economics after all, it might be about Europeans finally getting tired of explaining that confidence isn't the same as competence.